All right, so today we're diving into something that's been generating a lot of buzz lately. India's Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code.
The IBC.
Right, the IBC. And, from what I've been reading, it was introduced with such promise, a real potential game changer.
Absolutely.
And it seemed like in those early days, it might actually live up to the hype. I
Yeah.
mean, one of the first cases I came across involved, a corporate insolvency process, and they actually managed to recover 100% for the creditors.
Wow.
Like, that's the ideal scenario, right?
It's what it was designed to do.
Right.
Before the IBC, India had this reputation for having these really slow and often very ineffective insolvency laws.
Right.
It would drag on for years.
Oh, God.
Creditors would rarely see their money back. And the whole thing just felt like a huge drain on the system instead of, actually helping anyone.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly inefficient.
It really was.
So when these early cases started coming through with these really promising
It
results.
was exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it felt like a real turning point. Like finally things were changing.
Okay, so fast forward a few years, and there seems to be a shift in the conversation, right? Like initially it was all about resolution, finding a way to, salvage the situation, help the company get back on its feet.
Right.
Now it feels like it's become more about, who gets to recover the most money the fastest.
Yeah.
What do you make of that shift?
Well, you've hit on something really crucial there, and it gets to the heart of why we're even talking about this. The IBC, at its core, is supposed to be a lifeline.
Okay.
It's supposed to give struggling companies a chance to restructure their debts, to, maybe get a fresh start.
Right.
But if the focus becomes solely on maximizing how much creditors can recover as quickly as possible, even if it means sacrificing the long-term viability of the business,
Yeah.
well, you have to ask yourself, are we really achieving resolution, or are we just, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic?
That's
It's an interesting analogy.
it is a powerful analogy.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, I mean, is this focus on rapid recovery, is it actually counterproductive in the long run?
Well, that's the debate, isn't it?
Yeah.
One of the things we're seeing that's causing a lot of concern is this trend of what's known as asset stripping. Yeah. Essentially, creditors who are understandably eager to recoup their losses push for the quickest way to get at least some of their money back,
Which is
often, which means selling off company assets, often at significantly reduced prices.
so on the surface, that seems
It makes sense.
it makes sense, right? Like, of course, creditors want to recover what they're owed.
Of course, yeah.
But what are the wider implications of that approach?
So imagine you're a potential investor, right? And you're looking at a company that's just gone through this kind of fire sale.
Okay.
The best assets are gone. They've been sold off at bargain basement prices.
Right.
Would you be as likely to invest in what's left?
Probably not.
Probably not. And that's the danger here.
Okay.
Asset stripping it creates this chilling effect on future investment, which ultimately makes it much harder for that company to make a genuine turnaround.
So it's like
It's a vicious cycle.
yeah.
The pressure to recover quickly leads to decisions that, in the long run, make it harder for the company to actually recover.
Right.
And this is where the spotlight falls on the creditor-in-control model,
Okay.
because it's often seen as a key factor in this whole dynamic.
Creditor-in-control, it's a term you hear a lot when you're talking about the IBC.
It is.
But for those of us who, aren't knee-deep in insolvency law every day,
Right.
it can seem a little jargony.
Yeah.
So can you break it down for us?
Absolutely.
Why is this particular model at the center of so much debate?
Well, on the face of it, having creditors in control seems logical.
Right.
They're the ones who've put up the money.
Right.
So they should have a say in what happens.
They have the most at stake.
Exactly. But like so many things, it's much more nuanced than it appears at first glance.
Okay.
The current system, while it gives creditors a lot of power, it often overlooks the really crucial role of other stakeholders,
Okay.
particularly operational creditors.
So you're talking about like the suppliers, the vendors, the businesses that are actually providing the goods and services that the company needs to operate.
Exactly. The ones keeping the lights on, essentially.
Yeah.
But under this CIC model,
Yeah.
when a company is facing insolvency,
Yeah.
those operational creditors often find themselves at a real disadvantage
Really?
because while financial creditors, like your big banks and institutions,
Right.
they're prioritized in the whole recovery process.
Okay.
Operational creditors are often left fighting for whatever's left over.
So you're saying these businesses often, small to medium-sized enterprises,
Right.
They've provided good services, sometimes even extended credit to this company that's now struggling. And yet when push comes to shove, they're treated as less important than the big banks.
Sadly, that's often the reality, and it's a scenario we see playing out again and again.
Wow.
The sources you shared, some of them highlighted some really stark examples
Yeah.
of operational creditors, facing huge losses,
Yeah.
sometimes even being pushed to the brink themselves,
Oh.
while these secured creditors are walking away with, a much larger piece of the pie.
That just doesn't seem right.
It raises some serious questions about fairness
It does.
and, the long-term health of the entire business ecosystem.
Yeah, because it's not just about, abstract economic principles here.
Yeah.
Exactly. These are real people,
Absolutely.
real businesses,
Right.
and we're talking about livelihoods.
Mm-hmm.
The ripple effects that this can have on an entire supply chain.
100%. And there's another layer to this that's particularly concerning.
Okay.
Remember those promoters we talked about, the original business owners?
Yeah.
Well, in some cases, this IBC process has actually enabled them to regain control of a company after insolvency.
Really?
Yeah, often with their liabilities cleared,
Wait, so they get a clean slate
essentially.
while the people who supported them are left to deal with the fallout?
It's a scenario that's been dubbed phoenixing, this idea that a company can rise from the ashes of insolvency with the same ownership, but without the burden of those past debts.
Wow.
And of course, operational creditors are often the ones left high and dry.
So we're seeing this happen.
It's a trend that's emerging.
And this coupled with, what we were just talking about with the CIC model,
Exactly.
it begs the question, is the IBC in its current form, is it truly promoting resolution?
It's a good question.
Or is it just facilitating a transfer of losses from one group to another?
Yeah, it's a real concern. And it all ties into this idea of, are we truly looking out for all stakeholders or just certain ones?
Right. And speaking of looking out for certain stakeholders, this Section 12A of the IBC, it seems to be a bit of a hot button issue.
It is.
A lot of the sources I went through really highlighted this section as a potential area for, concern. Can you unpack that a bit for us? What is it and why is it causing so much controversy?
Yeah, it's like we're hitting the reset button for some, but others are left, holding the bag. And speaking of resets, this Section 12A of the IBC, it's definitely a controversial one.
It is.
A lot of the sources I read really honed in on this as a, real point of concern. So can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah.
What exactly is it?
Sure. So Section 12A, it's a clause within the IBC that allows for insolvency applications to be withdrawn even after they've been admitted.
Okay.
And in theory, it's supposed to encourage settlements, right? The idea is to avoid these long, drawn-out legal battles.
Right, sounds reasonable enough.
On the surface, it does, but as they say, the devil is in the details.
So where does the controversy come in? Is it the way it's being applied rather than, the intention itself? It's exactly. The intention was to streamline things, make the process more efficient. But what we're seeing is it's become more of a loophole.
A loophole?
Yeah, a way for some stakeholders to kind of game the system a bit.
Interesting.
And prioritize their own interests, sometimes at the expense of others.
At the expense of others.
Right. And there's this real lack of transparency in how these settlements are reached.
Okay.
And a concern that they're not always equitable. Not everyone's getting a fair shake.
Yeah. One of the sources I read actually used the term backdoor deals to describe how Section 12A is being used.
Yeah, and I could see why people would say that.
It doesn't exactly inspire confidence, does it?
No, not really. And it's a valid concern. We're seeing cases where these settlements are reached that favor certain creditors.
Right.
Often the ones with the most leverage. While others, like our operational creditors, are kind of left out in the cold.
Right. And that just seems to undermine the whole, the very spirit of the IBC, doesn't it?
Exactly. It raises the question of, is this truly resolution if it's not benefiting everyone involved?
Right. So if we're talking about, course correction, making sure the IBC actually lives up to its initial promise, what needs to change?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. What are some of the key changes that are being proposed?
Well, the good news is there's some concrete suggestions on the table. One of the most significant is this idea of rebalancing the power dynamic within the whole system.
Okay, so moving away from this strict creditor-in-control model.
Exactly. Create a more level playing field for everyone involved.
So how would that work in practice?
Well, one idea is to give operational creditors more voting power during the insolvency process.
Makes sense.
Right, so their voices are actually heard, their interests are considered.
Right, so it's not just the big banks calling all the shots.
Exactly. And there are also proposals to prioritize certain operational creditor claims. especially those of smaller businesses, recognizing how vulnerable they are in these situations.
Right, because their survival really depends on it.
Exactly. And it's all about recognizing that interconnectedness within the business ecosystem, right? The health of the entire system relies on fairness and balance.
Not just, the survival of the biggest players.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And alongside these structural changes, there's a real push for greater transparency throughout the entire process.
Okay.
Clearer guidelines on settlements, more disclosure around withdrawals under Section 12A.
Right.
We need a system that's accountable and equitable.
Because ultimately, a system that lacks transparency just breeds distrust, right?
Exactly. It undermines its own legitimacy.
And let's not forget about the importance of early intervention, right?
Absolutely.
Several experts are suggesting that, focusing on mediation dispute resolution before a company reaches a point of no return could be a real game changer.
It could be huge.
So it's like a bit of preventative care.
Exactly.
Instead of waiting until the patient's, on life support.
100%, encouraging dialogue.
Yeah.
Facilitating those out-of-court settlements.
Right.
These are all things that could prevent businesses from even entering that formal insolvency process in the first place.
It's acknowledging that insolvency isn't just a legal process, right? It's a symptom of, maybe some deeper challenges.
Yeah.
And it might require a more nuanced and collaborative approach.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The goal should be to create a system that promotes revitalization.
Revitalization.
Yeah, not just recovery, but a system that supports a genuine resolution that works for everyone involved.
Because a healthy economy relies on a healthy business ecosystem, right?
Absolutely.
Where risk is balanced with opportunity and the rules of the game are fair and transparent.
Exactly. And where everyone feels like they have a stake in the outcome.
Well said. And on that note of, a healthy ecosystem and hopefully some positive change, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of the IBC.
It's been my pleasure.
It's a topic that, can often feel very technical, very legalistic.
It can.
But as we've explored today, it has real-world implications.
Very real.
It's affecting businesses' livelihoods, the very fabric of the Indian economy.
And it's something that we should all be paying attention to.
Exactly. And the IBC, despite, we've talked about some of the flaws,
Sure.
it does represent a significant step forward.
It does.
But like any system, it needs to adapt, it needs to evolve, and it needs to learn from its own implementation.
Absolutely. We can't just stand still.
Exactly. This conversation about its strengths and weaknesses, it's far from over.
It's just beginning.
And it's a conversation that we should all be engaged in. So the next time you hear about a company facing insolvency, don't just think about the bottom line, think about the people, think about the businesses, those ripple effects.
The human impact.
Exactly. And ask yourself, is the system working as intended?
Good question.
Is it promoting true resolution, or is it simply shifting the burden?
Important to think about.
Because ultimately, a healthy economy depends on a system that's fair, transparent, and accountable to all.
Couldn't agree more.